So I'm peg-legging around after some knee surgery last week. But I figure that's my personal reintroduction to the world of modern medicine. Because we're here today to talk about the clinical trials process and how that really shapes the progress in our medical system. I'm very grateful because I actually had an ACL replacement from a tissue donor and really relied on all of the research about many different trials about outcomes of knee surgery and to figure out, to make my own decision about how I wanted to handle this injury. And so that really helped me kind of put into perspective about the role that research plays in these very personal decisions that we make. And I wanted to share a couple of stories about the clinical trials process that have made the news recently that you may have heard about. Last fall, we saw these headlines, which are kind of like a clinical trials dream come true. That a drug called Trikafta was approved to treat cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic disease that affects tens of thousands of Americans. And the good thing about this drug is that not only was it effective in improving lung function in these patients, but it also potentially works for 90% of these patients. So that's kind of the best case scenario here. But the clinical trials process is a long and complex process. And kind of, ironically, we're learning a lot about this week as everyone's trying to catch up on the clinical trials process and what it means for a potential vaccine for coronavirus. But one of the studies here locally that's illustrating the process as it goes through step by step is some really innovative work about using CRISPR gene editing to edit human cells to treat cancer. And so this is some exciting news that came out just last month, where initial results from these studies show that it's safe, at least. It doesn't cause any negative effects in humans. But that's just the first step. This is what we call a phase 1 trial, and there's still phase 2 and phase 3 to go before we can learn about its efficacy. But all along the way, there's a human cost to this as well. And an interesting story that I think illustrates this point really well actually came out just this morning in the New York Times, talking about the clinical trials for a drug to treat Alzheimer's called aducanumab. And this was a kind of a roller coaster story. So last year, just about a year ago, the drug was thought to essentially fail its expected targets, and the clinical trial was abruptly canceled. Since then, the company that was conducting the trial actually reanalyzed their data, and it turned out that it looked like the highest dosage of the drug seemed to be more promising than they had originally thought, and now the clinical trial is back on. But this, if you're able to read the story, I encourage you to follow it because it really talks about the human element of people who are dealing with this disease on a day-to-day basis and what it means to be involved in this process with such uncertainty. And so over the last few weeks, as we're talking about this issue, I've been speaking with patients, with doctors, with caregivers, with advocacy groups to learn about some of the different perspectives on the clinical trials process and the decisions that people have to make on a day-to-day basis. And so we're lucky to be joined today by Dr. Stephen Joffe, who's a pediatric oncologist and a bioethicist at Penn, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the stories that have shaped the system that we have today and the choices that we face in how we move that research forward. But before I turn it over to him, I want to leave you with the perspective of one of the patients that I talked to. This is Bill. He's an ALS patient who's being treated at the Center for Hope Clinic at Temple. And I think he has a really valuable perspective to share about what it means to him personally to be involved in this kind of unpredictable journey of clinical trials. So we'll hear from Bill, and then I'll turn it over to Steve.
I was having back problems over the summer. After seeing a few orthopedic surgeons, one suggested I see a neurologist. In September I did, and he died. He was fairly certain I had ALS. the doctor, after our first visit, prescribed one medication for me, and if I don't pronounce it correctly, Riluzole. And she explained the clinic to us. I am interested in keeping my quality of life up as long as I can. And I'm very hopeful this helps. To be blunt, there's not many options. And Dr. Patterson has confidence in it. I've spoken to my wife about it, and I'm willing to take that risk if it may not improve my quality of life, but keep it where I'm at right now for as long as a period of time as I can. And we're also involved in another study which we volunteered for. And this is a terrible, ugly disease. The great Lou Gehrig passed away 80 years ago from it. Quote, there isn't a cure yet, but these clinical trials that I hope to be involved in, hopefully will help me in the short term, but the people after me in the long term.
Great. Thank you all for coming out to see us and be part of the conversation tonight. I'm Steve Joffe. I'm a pediatric oncologist, as you heard, and a bioethicist at University of Pennsylvania, at the Penn School of Medicine. And Bill sort of said it all. So I want to just acknowledge that the perspective of patients like Bill, who actually got the message quite right? I'm joining this clinical trial. I'm hopeful that it's going to be helpful to me, but I'm also really hoping that this disease for which we have nothing or virtually nothing that can change the course of the disease, that my contribution to the clinical trial can help move that forward and change that over time. And that, I love to see that message, and I really appreciate when it comes from patients who bring that perspective. I want to talk about a little bit of the history of clinical trials and the history of therapeutic development and some of the things that we're looking for and some of the challenges. Some of the historical stories, I think, really sort of clarify or shed light on where we are today and the challenges that we face, even more today maybe than we did back when some of this started. So if you think about a disease for ALS or any other serious disease for which we don't have terrific treatments and we'd really like to improve treatments, we want drugs or other treatments for those diseases. And there's a balancing act that we're trying to play or struggling with. Because on the one hand, of course, we want the drugs or the treatments that are developed and that are made available to us, patients and our families, for those diseases to be safe, right? We want the evidence that they're safe. And we want them to be effective. And all of that means clinical trials, right? It means rigorously studying and testing the drugs and comparing them to the alternatives or sometimes to placebos to try to figure out, is this drug safe? What are the side effects of this drug? Is this drug effective? But here's the challenge. We also want them to be rapidly available. And if we really, really, really want to emphasize safety and effectiveness, then we're going to take a while to do those clinical trials, and we're going to do them really rigorously. And that means that it's going to take longer for the drug to be available. On the other hand, if our priority is let's make this drug available as quickly as possible, then by the time they get to patients, there's going to be less data about safety and efficacy. And that's the balancing act that we're struggling with. And I'll tell you a couple of stories to illustrate that. I should add, I realized earlier today that there's one other thing we want our drugs to be as well, and it's been on the news a lot, which is affordable. And I'll come back to that because that is yet another challenge. So a quick background. I'm not going to throw a bunch of statistics at you or words at you, but just a quick background about the history of the Food and Drug the Food and Drug Administration and the history of drug approval in the country, right? So the first thing, up until 1906, we really had nothing that regulated the drugs that were available. So any snake oil salesperson could sort of set themselves up and sell some sort of patent medicine, and there was really not much to do about it. In 1906, the Congress passed what was called the Pure Food and Drug Act, and this was only about one thing. It was about when you put a label on some product that you were selling as a medicine, it had to be accurate, and you couldn't put things into that medicine, into that bottle that didn't appear on the label. So it was all about accuracy and labeling and not adulterating the context of the bottle. No requirement that there be any safety testing, efficacy testing. Anybody could put anything in a bottle and sell it as long as it was accurately labeled. In 1938, in the wake of what was known as the sulfanilamide scandal, early antibiotic sulfanilamide, company mixed it, instead of using the appropriate diluent to dissolve the drug into the liquid, mixed it with something that's related to antifreeze. And something like 100 people in the country, mostly kids, took this antibiotic for whatever infections they had. And there were about 100 deaths as a result of people taking this bottles of this antibiotic that was dissolved in this toxic substance. Obviously a big scandal, and Congress, by this time the FDA was created as an agency. Congress passed something called the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. But all they said was drugs have to be safe. At this point, there's no requirement of any testing to show that drugs are effective for whatever it is that doctors or pharmacies or companies want to sell them for. It wasn't until 1962 that Congress passed something called the Kefauver-Harris Amendment to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which for the first time said that before a company is going to market a drug to the American public, there has to be evidence that it's actually effective for whatever it is the company wants to sell it for. This was motivated by the thalidomide story that many of you are probably familiar with, a drug that was given to women for morning sickness and other things associated with pregnancy. So you've got pregnant women taking this drug. This is mostly in Europe and Canada. Actually, the drug was not available in the US, so there was very little of this happening in the US. But the babies started to be born with these very short arms and legs because of the effects of the drug on the developing fetus. And the FDA, which had been reluctant to approve the drug, suddenly looked really smart because they had not approved a drug and not made it available for sale. And all of these things were happening elsewhere that were really quite tragic. And so Congress, in the wake of this, passed this amendment that said, well, the drugs we have to show that they're actually not just safe, but effective for whatever they're being sold for. Now, at that point, this is now paraphrasing the requirements, but the requirements for approval of a drug said, this is from colleagues who published in the British Medical Journal, basically the drug seems safe enough, and there's substantial evidence, keyword substantial, that the drug will have the effect it's represented to have based on adequate and well-controlled investigations, such as randomized controlled trials assessing validated clinical outcomes. And without remembering the specific words, the message here is we have to do really rigorous research to really show that the drug is safe and effective for what it is that the company wants to market it for. And so this set a pretty high standard and emphasized the safety and effectiveness side of this equation. Now, then came the 1980s and HIV. And I was a medical student in San Francisco in the early 1990s, so in the wake of, or in the midst of the raging HIV epidemic in one of the cities in the country that was the epicenter of the HIV epidemic in the United States. And as I would go onto the wards on my medicine rotation, all around me I was taking care of patients who had advanced AIDS, who may have tried some of the drugs that had started to become available, but the drugs weren't working very well, or maybe they worked for a short time and then they stopped working. And patients were getting pneumocystis pneumonia and Kaposi's sarcoma and cytomegalovirus and all of the other opportunistic infections that patients with advanced AIDS get. And patients with AIDS and advocates for patients with AIDS were not satisfied, understandably, with the pace of drug approval. There were a couple of antiviral drugs on the market at that time. There was not nearly enough. We didn't have the highly effective combination therapies that we have today. And patients were really mad, and advocates were really mad, and were really pushing the FDA and Congress to do something different to make these drugs available. So there's a lot of activity in Washington, a lot of protests. ACT UP is one of the more famous organizations, but there were many others that really pushed the scientific community, the pharmaceutical community, and Congress and the FDA to move more quickly. And one of the things that Congress did was in 1992 passed a new law that said that we're going to create a pathway to accelerate the approval of drugs for life-threatening diseases and serious diseases where there's an unmet medical need. And so they created something called the accelerated approval pathway, which basically lowered the standard for approval of drugs. So the drugs could be tested not quite to the same level and standard as they were tested before, but then made available to patients more quickly, but accepting a lower level of evidence that they were safe and effective. So this is a press release from June of 1992. Bush 1 administration, Louis Sullivan was the Secretary of Health and Human Services, announcing the approval of the first drug approved by this less rigorous standard called DDC, or zalcitabine. And just reading from the approval, DDC is the first drug approved under the principles and procedures of FDA's proposed accelerated drug review policy, endorsed by the White House Council on Competitiveness and announced by the Vice President on April 9th, Proposal, this is a key phrase, proposal also provides for prompt removal of the drug from the market if further review determines the therapy to be ineffective. So the idea was we'll get the drug out more quickly onto the market, we'll do additional studies, and if those additional studies show that the drug's actually not as effective or maybe has more toxicities than we thought, then we'll pull it from the market. This was a key component of the law. Importantly, has not worked out like the proponents thought it would work out because it has proved to be all but impossible to pull a drug off the market or for the FDA to say to a company, you must pull a drug off the market. And it happened only very few times, often with a big political firestorm around it. Sometimes companies say, we recognize that we need to pull our drug, but for the FDA to force an unwilling company virtually never happens, and I'm not sure it will ever happen again. Now here's the flip side to the HIV story, and this is one of, the, I think, the most major black marks on American medicine and someplace where we really fell down. So this is an article from the New York Times from 1990 about high-dose chemotherapy with autologous stem cell transplant for various types of cancers. The idea was that giving chemotherapy to patients, much chemotherapy was limited because if you gave too much, you would kill a patient's bone marrow, and if their bone marrow was killed, then they would die of an infection or bleeding or something because they couldn't produce blood cells. So the technology was developed in the 1980s to take out some bone marrow, store it away in the lab, give people even higher doses of chemotherapy that were possible before, and then give them their bone marrow back. The bone marrow would take root back in the bones and regrow, and you could rescue people from what otherwise would have been a lethal chemotherapy. Now this was first used for lymphoma and a couple of other blood disorders, and actually is still used for lymphoma and some other diseases. But doctors and scientists said, well, if it's going to work for lymphoma, maybe it can work for every other cancer. It'll just let us get more chemotherapy, more chemotherapy, more chemotherapy. One of the mantras I was taught in my oncology training was more is better. And so this took that literally. And the big place where there was a huge push to use this was in women with advanced breast cancer, a disease that it may have a long course, but it's a relentlessly progressive disease ultimately. And there were some early suggestions that this high-dose chemotherapy and then giving back the bone marrow might allow some women who would not have survived their breast cancer to now survive. This is going back into the 1980s. So a lot of excitement about this bone marrow transplant for breast cancer. What happened over the ensuing decades is that doctors wanted to run trials of this high-dose therapy for breast cancer, but the trials were not accruing any patients. Why were they not accruing any patients? Because if you entered a trial, you were randomized between the high-dose therapy, which there was all this excitement about, or standard chemotherapy, which had really pretty poor outcomes. And so if you were a woman or a family member of a woman, you say, well, I don't want to be in that trial. There's a 50% chance I might get the standard thing, which isn't great, whereas what I really want is this high-dose treatment. So women were declining to join the trials. All kinds of entities were springing up, first in for-profit oncology centers, and later on the academic centers said, well, we got to play this game too, to just offer this treatment to women without actually doing the rigorous research. And this was an article from 1995 about how Dr. Karen Antman, who at the time was in one of the New York hospitals, I think Sloan Kettering, could not get any women to join her trial because women wanted to do something different. Here we are to 1999, Gina Colada, the story has evolved. We're starting to get signals that maybe that doesn't work so great. And this is a really actually quite horrifying article about how the business of cancer treatment has drawn all of these women into these treatments without really the evidence that the treatment works. And so here we are 10 years later, we can't actually figure out if this treatment that tens of thousands of women are going through actually works. And the outcome of the story published in 2000 was this in the New England Journal, one of the flagship journals of medicine, actually from investigators primarily at Penn, saying, okay, we've finally done the trials and we've shown that they don't work. And this treatment that has been incredibly toxic for women and incredibly expensive, and this whole for-profit enterprise has sprung up around, isn't any better than the alternative now that we've finally done the research. And very quickly it went away, but that was 10 or more years of women getting treatment that was harmful to them and toxic to them and in no way better than the alternative. So conclusion, as compared with maintenance chemotherapy and conventional doses, the standard treatment, high-dose chemotherapy plus autologous stem cell transplant soon after the induction of complete or partial remission does not improve survival in women with metastatic breast cancer. We should have answered this question in 3 or 4 years. It shouldn't have taken us 12 years to do it. 5 trials were published around the same time. 4 of them showed that the treatment did not work. 1 of them seemed to show that the treatment did work. It was done in South Africa. It took about a year to figure out that that whole trial was a fraud, and actually in that one, it didn't work either. Not a happy story for medicine. Now, we're in the era now, I'm sure you've heard the term precision medicine or personalized medicine. We're in that era. This is probably the story that starts that. This is a drug called imatinib, which a scientist, a physician who at first was at Dana-Farber in Boston and then went to Oregon Health Sciences, named Brian Drucker, said, okay, we understand this disease, chronic myeloid leukemia. We understand that there's a particular genetic change in the disease. And if we can design a drug or find a drug to target that genetic change, maybe we can shut off the thing that's driving the cancer. So we started to do trials of this imatinib drug for people with chronic myeloid leukemia, a disease that progresses over years, but does, or at least at that time, did relentlessly progress. And this was the key article also published in the New England Journal in 2003. And this is, most of you are probably unfamiliar with looking at these graphs, but focus on, if I can figure out my pointer. If you focus on, is that showing up? Yeah. If these are the people, there are a few different groups, but these top 3 bars are the people who got the drug. And the people down here are the people who did not get the drug, who got the standard therapy at the time. And the key thing is every time the curve here drops, that means that 1 patient progressed with their disease. And so the key point is that these bottom curves, the patients who were not getting imatinib, they were progressing more quickly than the patients who were getting the imatinib. This was a huge effect for this drug, and the drug was very rapidly approved by the FDA and became the standard of care for this disease. So here's the article announcing the very fast approval for the first truly personalized genetically targeted drug. This is a story that came out in Stat News, a really terrific source of news about health and science, about 3 years ago. These were 2 women who were in the early trials for CML. They're now something like 20-year survivors of this disease. Back when they were on the trial, nobody survived 20 years. And here they are, they've become friends through their trial, and they are 17 or 20-year survivors of this disease that nobody thought that they would survive this long. So a really sort of key story about how when things go right, they can go right. And the last story to tell you, and this you saw a picture, although you didn't hear his name, but you saw a picture of Carl June earlier when Jayatri was talking. This is Emily Whitehead. Emily was a 7-year-old who was treated for a very resistant leukemia at my institution at CHOP back, I think it was 2009 or 2010. And although she got an infusion of these genetically modified immune cells, genetically modified to attack her cancer. And it worked better than anybody's dreams. It worked so well that the toxicity of the remarkable reaction almost killed her. But due to some drugs that were tried as a kind of last-ditch effort, she was pulled through this critical illness. And here she is a couple of years ago as a 14-year-old, really a kind of ambassador for this remarkable new treatment, the engineering of cells to actually go immunologically attack cancers. And I think we're going to see a lot more of it. It's now approved for lymphoma, and it's approved for this childhood leukemia. I think before too long, there'll probably be some approved for multiple myeloma and some other things. So this is where the technology is going. Now I want to sort of circle back to a couple things I mentioned at the beginning, and then we'll stop and have a discussion. There are major challenges with where we are, and one of them is what things cost. Right? So Gleevec, or imatinib, the chronic myeloid leukemia drug, when it was first on the market, was about $40,000 a year. Right? Already a lot of money. So you can see back in 2005. And the price went up and up and up. And then in 2013, the patent expired and the drug went generic. And what's supposed to happen when drugs go generic? Prices are supposed to come down, right? But I don't see any sort of trend down in this graph. The prices just continue to go up. So now it's about $125,000, $130,000 a year list price for this drug. Really hard to understand why the price continues to go up of this drug that's generic. And this is, I looked on Zillow a few days ago, and this was a lovely, 2-bedroom, 1-bath, 1,200 square foot apartment that you could get not too far from here for $419,000. This is actually less than the cost of the treatment that Emily Whitehead got that you can now buy from Novartis, which is $425,000. So with that $425,000 you could spend on those T cells, you could buy this apartment for cash and have $6,000 left over for drapes. So that's where our drugs are going. Recently, a gene therapy was approved for an infant disease called spinal muscular atrophy. It's a one-time dose if it goes well, $2.1 million, the biggest single number attached to any drug. So we're really talking about extraordinary prices and having to figure out how we deal with the fact, it's one thing if it's just a few patients here and there, but once it starts to become common that patients are getting drugs priced at these levels, how do we deal with that? And then I want to end where I started, which is we want drugs to be safe and effective, which means studying them really rigorously. And we want drugs to be rapidly available, which means potentially truncating the research so we can get them out to patients, get them out to the market. And how we navigate that balance between, on the one hand, rigorous research and really high quality evidence, what we all want for the drugs that we take, and rapid availability. What we also want, if we have a disease for which there aren't great options, is really the challenge that is very much on the table today. So with that, I will stop, and thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
So I have a couple of questions to start off our discussion, but we encourage all of you to send us your questions as well. You can either email us at speakerseries@fi.edu or tweet at us at #TalkFI. So Steve, I want to start out with a question about your personal journey into this topic. You started out as a medical student, and how did you integrate ethics into your line of work?
So I mentioned that I was a medical student in San Francisco, and I somewhere along the way took a classroom course sitting in a room like this on medical ethics, and I just thought it was really interesting. I was really interested in all of the issues of how we respect patient autonomy, how we take patients' best interests into account, how we navigate these issues of making sure that everybody has sort of just and fair access to medical treatments, some of the basic things that you talk about in medical ethics. And then I hit the wards, and I was at San Francisco General Hospital, which is one of the hospitals that we could rotate through, about 9 o'clock one night, and I was on the neurology rotation, probably 2 weeks into my time as a clinical medical student, my very first rotation. And I was sitting with the other people on the neurology service, and somebody's pager went off, and there was a woman in the emergency room who, for the last 24 hours, had had the onset of paralysis, inability to walk. She was having trouble going to the bathroom. And if you're a neurologist or a physician, that story, she was about 90 years old, so especially in an older person, you hear that story and you know that she's got some kind of cancer pressing on her spinal cord. And when that's happening, you either treat it with surgery or radiation within a matter of hours, or you risk permanent paralysis. So we went rushing down to the emergency room and met this lady who was 90, who was in the country only a couple of years from Central America. She'd lived her whole life in Central America. She was a Spanish speaker. And she had come because her kids, who were in their 60s, had been living in San Francisco for a while, and they'd said, we got to get grandma here to live with us. And we went to go talk with her about the treatment that we were recommending, which was radiation. And her kids, again, in their 60s, also, now they were English speakers as well as Spanish speakers, said, no, you can't talk with our mom. We'll give you permission to treat her. But we've got to let her know, she's got to give us permission. She's mentally capable. She doesn't have dementia or anything like that. She's got to give us permission. No, sorry, you can't talk with her. We know she's got cancer because we were treated at another hospital and they told us she had stomach cancer a month ago, but we didn't tell her, and she doesn't know she's got cancer, and it would kill her to know she's got cancer, and you can't tell her she's got cancer. So I'm this little, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed medical student fascinated by how to navigate this sort of dilemma between the family and the patient and the medical team. And this was a standoff that lasted a couple of hours until the radiation oncology doctor, the specialist, who happened to be from Central America herself, who happened to be a native Spanish speaker, who happened to be able to speak with people in their language and navigate their culture, showed up and said, let me try to talk to her. And she spoke with the family. She said, I'd like to find out from your mom what she would like to know. And is she somebody who wants you to make the decisions for her, or she wants to make her own decisions? So I'd like to just sort of get into that conversation with her. And the family, after much resistance, said, okay, we'll be in the back of the room and we're going to sort of shut you down if you go too far, but like, go for it. And she was sensitively able to navigate this discussion where our patient said, no, you got to tell me what's going on and I'll tell you what I want you to do. And when the family heard that, they relaxed and she gave us permission and went off for her radiation treatment. And for me, this was my first real world introduction to medical ethics, really happening there in front of me, and I was hooked.
Yeah, and I think that story really reflects what we see a lot in terms of how we talk about science too, is that it's not just about facts, it's not just about statistics, it's about values and how you relate to people in personal ways. And I think your perspective on ethics really brings that into the picture. So before we get into some of the details of what you talked about, I just want to set baseline for our audience here in terms of understanding how clinical trials work and the principles of what we call the gold standard of a randomized clinical trial.
Sure. So to give you a sort of brief introduction to clinical trials, drugs are first going to be, new drugs or new therapies, new biologicals, are first going to be tested in various laboratory settings, maybe in various cell cultures or maybe in various animal models before they ever get to the first person. But once it seems like there's promise in a drug, we then have to take it to a person for the very first time. Somebody's got to be the first human being ever to get that drug. And so you can imagine the amount of uncertainty that goes with how to give it, including what dose do I give? Do I give 1 milligram or 1,000 milligrams? I don't know. You might be able to make some guesses based on animals or some other mechanism, but that's the kind of question that you don't even know when you go to give it to that first patient or that first person participating in your trial. And so the first trials that are done are called phase 1 trials, and often the drug will be given starting at a very low dose, sometimes to actually healthy people who just volunteer to be a part of these trials. They'll do it typically for money. And they may go to a research center and be in a trial for a few weeks, and they're getting paid to get that drug. For drugs that are expected to have more toxicities, cancer drugs and things like that, it'll be done in patients who actually have the disease. And the drug may be started at a very low dose, and then if the first few patients seem to do, or I shouldn't even say patients, because at this point they're really research participants, seem to be doing okay, then they'll go up to the next dose in the next group and the next dose until they start to see reasons why they should slow down or stop. And so at the end of that phase 1 trial, we may know a little bit about the toxicities, the side effects that it causes. We may have some guess about the best dose, although even then we can't be quite sure. And it's time to move on to phase 2. We may not have learned anything about whether the drug works, or maybe there's some early hints. We move on to phase 2. In phase 2, the drug is typically given to a relatively small number of people with the disease. Relatively small meaning maybe 100 or a couple of hundred. And we look to see, is there an effect? There might be a comparison to some other group, or there might not. And if it's looking promising at the stage of phase 2, then companies will do a phase 3 trial. And in a phase 3 trial, the drug will be compared sometimes to a placebo, depending upon the circumstance, sometimes to, let's say, a standard therapy that patients might otherwise get for the disease. And at this point, the drug is probably given to several hundred, maybe even up to several thousand people. And the trial is run. And people are in the trial for however long they're in the trial. And at the end of the trial, which may take several years, statisticians look at the data. And yeah, it looks like people who got the drug are doing much better than people who got whatever the alternative, or no, they don't. And so a decision is made about whether the drug can be proposed for marketing or not. Now, sometimes early on in the process, maybe after phase 2, the data are so compelling, boy, this drug is really phenomenal and it's good enough to take forward to the market and to give to patients. Sometimes in what I showed you, the accelerated approval pathway, where it's not as definitive as we would like it to be, but we're going to try to get it to people early, and then we'll try to do additional research. Remember, it's really hard to pull drugs from the market if they don't work based on that additional research. But that's the general pathway of clinical trials.
Right. And so that helps us understand, how patients are placed into these different arms of the trial. And like you described for that breast cancer study, patients do face the option of being placed in the placebo arm, and so this ends up it's good long term in terms of helping us carry out careful research, but there's a chance that you may not necessarily get that personal benefit. And so this choice is something that patients are facing, and I think in reaction to that, we saw the passage of the right to try law last year. Can you explain that law and the impact that it has or has not had?
The impact that it is not, I will explain the impact that it has not had, we'll put it that way. But to do that, I have to go back further, really actually to the late 1980s, when the FDA realized, or Congress realized, that, okay, we're doing clinical trials, we're really committed to clinical trials. The clinical trials are the only way we get the evidence that a drug works or it doesn't work. But sometimes patients can't take part in the clinical trials. Maybe the clinical trial is in Philadelphia, but the patient lives in Idaho, and it's unreasonable to say to the patient to come from Idaho to Philadelphia for the trial. Or maybe we're in a pause between the phases, or maybe all the trials have been completed and we're just now waiting for the FDA to make a decision, which takes 6 or 9 months or something like that. So there are these periods where the ideal way to get the drug would be through a clinical trial, but we can't get it that way. And so the FDA created something called the expanded access pathway, which is a way for patients who couldn't take part in clinical trials to get access to a drug, limited to drugs for serious or life-threatening conditions, so not just any drug, no good alternatives, patients can't take part in the clinical trials. And there's a series of things that you have to go to. First of all, the company has to say, yes, we're willing to provide the drug. And often the companies, sometimes for very valid reasons, say no. There has to be a doctor who's willing to prescribe it and monitor it. The Institutional Review Board, which usually oversees research but has been tasked with this additional thing, has to say yes, and the FDA has to say yes. Now, it turns out that the FDA says yes about 99% of the time, so it was never a barrier to people getting access to the drugs. But a group of advocates based at an institute called the Goldwater Institute, a libertarian think tank and institute in Arizona, said, we think this isn't good enough, and we don't think that there should be any role for the government in telling patients and doctors what they can do. So we're going to advocate for a law that takes the FDA completely out of the picture and says, well, it's going to be between the doctor and the patient, and a company has to say yes. And first they got a bunch of states to pass a law for the state that said, we don't need the FDA, but the way the law works, I've been taught by my lawyer friends, is that state law can't preempt federal law, and so this was pretty much ineffective. But then a couple of years ago, really with the advocacy of Vice President Pence, President Trump signed the federal right to try bill that said now there's this other pathway, we still have expanded access, but there's this other pathway called right to try. And what's really most different about it is that you don't need the FDA approval. A bunch of us advocated that that was a big mistake, in part because the FDA always said yes, so it was never the barrier, in part because the FDA about 10% of the time said yes, and here's how you can do it better, or here's how you can do it more safely, so they actually added value. Anyway, the law was passed about almost 2 years ago, and we think that somewhere between 10 and 15 people in the entire country have taken advantage of this law. So it was like a big old nothing burger. And some political points, because it sounds good, right? If you want to do something that sounds politically good. But in terms of actually making a difference in people's lives, there's been basically no action from this law, which is what a number of us forecasted. One of the things that was behind it is there's an anti-regulatory strand in the country that saw the FDA as a soft target because the FDA could be cast as this sort of demon that stood between patients and life-saving treatments. And so this was part of a larger anti-regulatory agenda. And I think this is not the last assault we will see on the FDA. In fact, there already are others that are starting to come forward, many of which come from the same institute.
So again, another example of where values are, around different issues are intersecting with medicine. So we have a number of questions coming in from the audience. I want to start, just kind of jumping off of what we were just talking about in terms of some of the ethical issues in terms of access to drugs. So one question that someone has posed is about the ethical balance of conducting trials in other countries where the drug may not be available. How often does that happen, and how does that intersect with what we're doing here?
The clinical trials process it's a great question. The clinical trials process has gone global. And in fact, if you are a company, you are a multinational company or a US-based company, you are absolutely looking outside of the United States for patients. Partly because you want to market the drugs or make the drugs available to people in those countries, which is the right reason to be doing it. Partly because There are large numbers of patients in many countries who would value access to drugs through clinical trials, who might not be able to get them any other way, and who may not have as many alternatives for their treatment, so the clinical trial looks better and better, or may not have had as much complicated pretreatment, and so they're sort of simpler patients. They don't have the complicated histories of multiple drugs that they've taken before. So there are lots of good and maybe more sort of questionable reasons to look outside the US for drugs. At the same time, as I've spoken with people in companies, they're very concerned about doing this in the right way, having high quality research that goes on, doing it in ways that are not harmful to the people who are taking part in trials, often who actually benefit from being in the trials. And remember that there are massive medical needs in lots of countries, especially low and middle income countries across the world. And it is really essential to do research in those countries so that we can actually meet their medical needs. One of the challenges is what's been called the 90-10 divide, that 90% of the research resources and investments go into studying diseases that affect 10% of the world's population. And childhood diarrhea, and pneumonia, and malaria, and dengue fever, and all of the other things that are affecting people across the world are getting much less attention. So I'm a big advocate of doing research in a global context, but obviously the ethical issues get more complex and really need to be paying attention to people's rights, to the challenges of informed consent, to the political context in which they work, and to will people, not just the people in your trials, but actually the people in the country or in the communities, will they actually benefit from the research that you're doing?
So that's a great lead-in to another question that we have from the audience, is what kind of methods are employed to ensure that clinical trials do include diverse participants, and particularly people of color?
Great question. It has actually been a real challenge. There's some variability from different diseases, but it has been a real challenge to ensure, just thinking about domestically in the US, that the people who take part in clinical trials represent the people who live in our country and who might need the treatments. It turns out that for a long time people thought that that was because people of color were skeptical of clinical trials, were more likely to say no to clinical trials if offered. And some research actually suggests that there might be some pockets where that's true, or some particular conditions, but across the board, that turns out not to be true, that people...
And is that perception kind of related to some of the injustices that have been
Absolutely, absolutely. I think many of you are probably familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis study, which is one that, from I think 1929 to 1972, the Public Health Service, just following men in the rural South, African-American men with syphilis, without offering them treatment, while doing spinal taps on them that were actually to get spinal fluid, but they were lied to and said this is part of your treatment, and then actually prevented from getting treatment when it was available. So that's the legacy that we're dealing with. But it turns out that when people are in a relationship with a hospital, with a doctor, trust develops that allows them to get past that. And so the data just really don't support that people of color or people from lower socioeconomic groups are more likely to say no to clinical trials. When they are offered the clinical trial, the proportions of people who say yes are actually pretty comparable. What does happen is that the clinical trials aren't offered where the people are. So if you get your care at the fancy academic hospital in town, you're more likely to have a clinical trial offered to you because you are getting your care in the place where they're done. If you get your care in the hospital, the community hospital that has served your community for decades, the clinical trial is less likely to be there. So that's part of the explanation for why it is. Part of the explanation is also that the more what are called comorbidities people have, the more sort of complicated their medical situations are, the less likely they are to be eligible for the trial. And then finally, I think there's some bias in who is offered a trial. So if you are a white, wealthy, highly educated individual, your doctor might be more likely to look at you and say, you look like the kind of person I can have a conversation with about this clinical trial. On the other hand, if there are more differences between your doctor and you, your doctor might be less likely to offer the trial. So the problems are, number one, the trials aren't done where people actually get their care. Number two, people may not be eligible for trial in different proportions. And number three, people actually may not be offered a trial, even if they actually do get their care at that institution and they actually are eligible. But when it comes to people actually being offered a trial, the data just don't support that people are more likely to say no if they come from minority backgrounds or low-income backgrounds.
So yeah, this intersection of values and who we are and how we relate to people, you know, in those relationships keeps coming back over and over again. To scale up, we've got a bunch of questions that, you know, that are, I think, coming from the open question that you left us about cost. So, you know, why do drugs cost so much money? You know, there's a perception that, you know, pharmaceutical companies are either trying to make a profit or just trying to recoup their expenses in research and development. Where does that price tag come from?
Well, I think the reason, with apologies to anybody here who works in this space, I think the reason companies charge so much is because they can, and because we don't have mechanisms to stop them from doing so, right? So the first thing is, if you own the patent on a drug, and there are various other ways where you can get exclusivity, you can market that drug and nobody else can market that drug. So until imatinib, that chronic myeloid leukemia drug that I showed you, went generic, nobody else could make imatinib and sell it in this country, right? They had the patent and nobody else could sell it. So what was there to limit their ability to charge? Well, Medicare, which is the biggest single entity paying for people's drugs in the country, is precluded by law from negotiating prices. So they basically have to pay whatever companies want. Private insurers can actually push back on prices, and they do to some extent. But imagine that you're the patient that needs that drug, that's the only drug that is shown to be effective for your disease, and your insurance company says, no, we won't pay for it because it costs too much. You're not going to be happy. You're going to be talking to your local newspaper. You're going to be talking to your local legislator. You're going to be posting it on Twitter or Facebook or something. You're going to be making a big stink, and the company is going to buckle. So it's just not a happy place for companies to be saying no to drugs that Medicare is paying for. And so on the one hand, we grant companies a monopoly to sell their drug, and on the other hand, we prevent the biggest sort of players or buyers of the drugs from actually negotiating the prices. So if you're the CEO of a major pharmaceutical company, your incentives are to sort of charge as much as the market will bear. And since there's really no functioning market, it comes to what are the norms. And as you look around at your competitors or your peers, and they're raising the prices of their drugs, you're going to raise the price of your drug. Generics have helped, but lots of the really highly effective new drugs, it's going to be a while before the generics. Companies have ways of extending their patents so that the generics take longer to appear. The data on research and development, you alluded to that, right? So one argument is, well, companies are taking all this money and reinvesting it in research and development. But actually, I have no doubt that if we substantially made a dent in drug prices, that will have some impact on innovation and research and development. How big it is debated. But the fact is that most of those profits are not going to research and development. Most of the revenues are going into marketing. They're going into profits for shareholders. Things like that. So research and development, really important, and there's a lot of range. Some companies putting much more of their revenues into research and development, others much less. But overall, that's not where the bulk of the money's going.
So, you know, we're sitting here on Super Tuesday,
Yeah.
without necessarily getting into any particular candidate's platform. It sounds like, you know, just, you know, based on the current Medicare system, simply, you know, moving to a Medicare for all in and of itself wouldn't necessarily solve the problem of drug pricing. So what are some other strategies that we can consider to bring those prices down?
I think the first one would be to give Medicare the ability to negotiate drug prices, right? Here you've got the biggest payer in the country, and it is unable to negotiate. It's unable to negotiate with companies. Now, that's challenging because if you're the only buyer, your leverage is really, are we going to walk away? And in the United Kingdom, where they actually have an entity that says, yes, this drug meets cost effectiveness thresholds, or no, it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then either you, the company, bring the price down, or we walk away. Cancer patients, the community that I'm the most familiar with, have not been happy with the idea that NICE, the entity in the UK, has been willing to say, well, we're going to walk away, and the National Health Service has said, we'll walk away from this drug, and no, patients in the UK can't have it, at least through our public system. So it's going to be a really heavy lift if Medicare starts to say, no, we're actually not going to buy your drug. The other thing is, I talked about the $425,000 drug that was developed out of the Emily Whitehead story. And it turns out that's a whole lot of money, and yes, that will buy you that 2-bedroom apartment a few blocks from here. But it's actually when entities that have looked at cost effectiveness have looked at that, if you're taking $425,000 and spending it on the life of a kid who may live 60 or 70 years if they are cured, or who will live 1 year if they're not, it turns out that that's highly cost effective. So even $425,000, if you're just looking on cost effectiveness grounds, may be money well spent. On the other hand, $240,000, $280,000 a year for a cancer drug that you got to take chronically until it stops working, that's going to be a tougher sell. One last story, which is David Mitchell is a patient with myeloma who leads a patient advocacy group, which is one of the groups that has really pushed hardest to lower drug prices. And so he's very public about his illness and about what's going on with him. And I saw a Twitter post from him recently. Actually, I'm not sure where he lives, but I saw a Twitter post from him where he talked about, he showed a picture of the label from the drug that he had picked up from his pharmacy, the oral myeloma pills that he takes once a day. And the price for that 1 month supply was $16,000. And now most of that is going to get paid by his insurer, which that's a pretty heavy burden for an insurer to pay, especially for a relatively common disease. His price for that is just under $1,000. So here he is bearing the $1,000 a month cost that he has to bear just for himself and his family to sort of keep up with this drug. So 2 components to this: what do we bear as a society, and what do we have to bear as individuals, depending upon the precise nature of the insurance we have.
So on that note of the trade-offs and rights of individuals versus benefit to society, we have a couple of questions around data sharing and privacy. So kind of flip sides of the coin here. On one hand, how can more transparency and data sharing across companies maybe help speed development and improve safety of drugs? On the other hand, what are the challenges of data protection for the individual patient?
Wonderful question. So my view is when it comes to health and medicine and moving science forward, we're all in it together. And so if my data can be helpful in that project of moving treatments forward, then I want that to happen, and I hope other people will do that too. So on the one hand, I want my data and I want everybody to feel like their data can be a part of this collective project. And on the other hand, I don't want people to be going into the data set to figure out which row in that spreadsheet is Steve Joffe and which row is Jayatri Das, and what else can you learn about me, and there are these confidentiality issues. I think you all know that we're at the point where guaranteeing somebody's anonymity is really difficult. You could strip out every sort of traditional identifier from a data set, and by combining one data set with another data set, you can very easily re-identify people with the right kind of technologies and scale of data. And it doesn't take all that many data points. And that's true even if you don't have genetic data, but when you start to throw genetic data into the mix, unless anybody in the room is an identical twin, each of us is the only person in the world who has our precise genetic code. And so that genetic code is really a signature of us, again, unless you're an identical twin. And so it's really hard to guarantee anonymity when data, really rich data from our electronic health records, data from our genetics are made available in data sets. And yet we have to do that in order to move the science forward. My view is that the restrictions really ought to be not so much around the anonymizing of the data sets or the consent requirements for using data. I think that is really unworkable at the kind of scale of data that we're talking about, but rather let's make sure that the data aren't misused. And if you, a company or you, a researcher, get access to a data set and you try to re-identify people or you try to use those data in ways that harm people, then there should be really serious penalties, civil and criminal penalties, for doing that. We don't have legislation like that. We have some relatively weak anti-discrimination laws related in particular to genetic data, but we really don't have comprehensive regulations or legislation. One more quick story. I'm part of an international consortium for research in bone marrow transplant, where data on every bone marrow transplant conducted in the country is collected by this registry, which happens to be at the Medical College of Wisconsin, and is made available to researchers for research related to bone marrow transplant. For many years, they partnered with an equivalent registry in Europe called the EBMT, the European Bone Marrow Transplant Registry. And then Europe passed the General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR, in the last few years, making it much more difficult to share data. And that collaboration between the US group and the European group basically just stopped in its tracks. And the lawyers are trying to figure out how to make it work again, but navigating between the very, very restrictive European rules and the probably not as restrictive enough US rules has proved an impossible challenge so far.
So we have a lot of interest in some of your own personal experiences as a doctor and somebody who's been involved with clinical trials. As somebody who works in the pediatric world, what's your take on the dilemma when a child who is technically 18 and their parents may disagree on what their choice of course of treatment might be?
Well, when the child is 18, which is the age of majority in most states. Actually, there's a few states that have 19 or 21 as the age of majority. If you go to Mississippi as a 19-year-old, you go from being an adult in Pennsylvania to a kid in Mississippi. True in the District of Columbia as well. But if you are a legal adult in whichever state that you are the absolute decision maker for your care. So that means if your parents disagree, now of course most 18, 19, 20-year-olds, if they have a good relationship with their parent, are going to get in a conversation, and maybe their parents are going to convince them, no, you should actually do this other thing. And that's all fine. Like, families can talk to each other and come to decisions. But if at the end of the day, the parents and the kid disagrees, or the parents and the young adult disagrees, the issue is the young adult gets to make a decision for themselves. A harder situation is when you've got somebody who's 16 or 17 and is pretty savvy and understands their disease and is the one who needs to live with their disease, and their parents want one thing for them and they want another. Now again, they can go off to, they can go into a corner and negotiate with each other and come back with the decision that they can all agree on. And that's the ideal, is right, you work it out and then you come back with one decision. It's very difficult. First of all, in most cases legally, you can't treat a kid without their parents' permission. So if the parents say no, it's going to be very difficult to treat them. But if the parents say yes and the kid says no, then there's actually a real practical dilemma, because the parents may really want you to treat their kid, and yet the kid is saying no. And to force treatment on a kid who's a smart 15 or 16 or 17-year-old is both ethically and emotionally and psychologically difficult, and depending on how the treatment is given, may be physically very difficult as well. What are you going to do? Hold them down? I'll just tell you one story related to this. This just may take a moment, but it's a story that has always stuck with me. Early on in my career as a pediatric oncologist and when I was doing bioethics, a colleague came to me, a young colleague, and she told me about a patient that she was taking care of who was a very smart 13-year-old, 8th grader, and was eligible for a clinical trial for a bone tumor that he had. And his parents, one was a scientist, one was a lawyer, I can't remember which, very highly educated people, had really done their research and were aware that the clinical trial that he was being offered was based on a hypothesis that had really panned out for breast cancer, intensifying the chemotherapy in a particular way. And it turned out that that had really made a difference for women with breast cancer. So we didn't know yet if it made a difference for the kind of bone tumor that this kid had. But the parents had seen this literature and done their research and really wanted him in the trial, recognizing and accepting that there was a 50% chance that he would actually get randomized to this more intensive treatment, which is what they wanted, or he might get randomized to the standard treatment, which they would be disappointed by, but they would understand, because they understood the scientific reason why there had to be this comparison. Really very sophisticated parents. Kid, equally sophisticated despite being just 13, said, I looked here in the consent form, and it says that the more intensified chemotherapy might mean that I have to be in the hospital more, and might mean that I might get more fevers, and might mean that I might be sicker. And I'm in 8th grade, and I'm the editor of my middle school newspaper, and I really care about having a great 8th grade year and doing well in school, and I want to do well as the editor of the newspaper. And if there's a risk that I'm going to be sicker and in the hospital more, and I can't do what I really want to do, which is to edit my school newspaper, I don't want to be in the trial. So really savvy parents with great reasons for wanting to be in the trial, really savvy kid with great reason for not wanting to be in the trial. My colleague said, what do I do? I said, well, Debbie, that's a tough one. What ultimately happened there was, we were talking about negotiation within families, and the family went on, wasn't a decision that had to be made today, and so the family went home and they came back a few days later, and they said, we've agreed he's going to be in the trial. I think the kid was kind of browbeaten into being in the trial, but at the end of the day, he was in the trial. And that's the kind of really tough decision, is when you've got a kid who may not have the legal right to make decisions for themselves, but clearly has an ethical right, and we have an ethical responsibility to listen to them, and they really know what they're talking about, and they express a really clear view.
Yeah, we see lots of those really smart, savvy kids here.
Yeah, this would be the kind of kid, if he lived in Philadelphia, he would have been a regular at the Franklin Institute. I actually got to know him a little bit, and I can say that with confidence.
So one quick clarification is that, if you're a physician running a clinical trial, can you enroll your own patients in the trial that you're running?
A wonderful question. Colleagues and I just wrote an article about this last year, and we got about 15 people writing in on both sides of whether we were right or wrong. It turns out, in cancer, which is not all of medicine, obviously, it has become the norm for people who run clinical trials to, if they have a patient who's eligible for their clinical trial, to offer that clinical trial to their patient, and is not perceived as an unmanageable conflict of interest. The reason I use the phrase conflict of interest is I'm not talking about money here, financial conflicts of interest. I'm talking about the conflict of interest that comes up when, on the one hand, I want to do the best thing for my patient, and on the other hand, I want to answer the question, I want to do the research that lets me get to an answer. And so there's a conflict between your scientific goals and your medical goals for this patient. Sometimes they line up perfectly, but not always. So I was talking to a colleague in Boston who was a very senior cardiologist, and I was saying, it's, in cancer medicine, it's kind of routine for doctors to invite their own patients to be in their trials if they're eligible. And my colleague was just horrified. He said this, now I can't speak for all of cardiology. If there's any cardiologists in the audience, you can tell me if it's true where you practice. But my colleague was horrified. He said, if I'm on the wards and a patient that I'm taking care of is eligible for my trial, he did a lot of trials, then I step aside and I let one of my colleagues invite them to be in the trial. Because I feel like if I ask them, they're going to feel pressured to be in the trial. And it's going to be hard for them to say no. And so if he was right about cardiology, then the norms and culture in that field are very different than they are in oncology. Anyway, we wrote about this. We said that there are some trials where patients, there's very little downside to the patient being in the trial, and the doctor has no particular stake or doesn't have a strong stake in whether the patient enrolls or doesn't enroll. At that end of the spectrum, it's probably okay for them to invite their own patients. At the other end, where there's really strong potential downsides for the patient, or the doctor has a very strong stake in whether or not the patient joins, they probably should not. And obviously there's a big gray area in the middle.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So as we wrap up our conversation, I want to shift back to the right side of the balance that you showed of, how do we speed up the rate of approval? We have a couple of questions about that. One is that, is there extra liability protection for pharmaceutical companies when, for maybe external pressures, that speed is prioritized over safety and efficiency? And we're seeing some of this with some of the conversation around coronavirus vaccines.
There is not, to my knowledge, a lot of liability for companies in taking things through this research pathway, as long as they play by the rules, right? As long as they are, there's not any kind of fraud or scientific misconduct in what they're doing internally, as long as the information that they need to communicate to doctors who are investigators who are enrolling people in trials, information to make available to patients, as long as all of that information is out there, it's hard for me to think of cases where there has been legal liability for a company. On the other hand, if they sort of mess with the rules, if they sort of keep data that should be made available to the public or to investigators, if they're not sort of completely transparent with their data, then there could be a case, I think, I'm not speaking as a lawyer, so I'm sure there are lawyers in the room, you can tell me where I get this wrong, but I imagine that there could be some sort of like a product liability claim made. There really have been, it's hard for me to think of cases where companies have been sued for something that went wrong in the research process. Companies are sued for all kinds of things once drugs are marketed, and there have been some one of the drugs that I mentioned, the gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy, the one that is $2.1 million, the company that Novartis bought that had developed that drug was accused of not providing to the FDA some data on some animal toxicity that they'd experienced in earlier phases of the research. And there was a big public sort of blow up about that, and the FDA was not happy. I'm not aware of lawsuits, although maybe they're sort of starting to be filed. But those are the sorts of things that companies can't do and shouldn't do, and will get them into trouble. If they play by the research rules, I'm not aware of a lot of problems happening.
A follow-up question about the Right to Try Act. Are you familiar with any of the 10 to 15 cases that did go through the law, and what were the how did they differ from having maybe gone through the expanded access?
Many of them, I actually just heard a wonderful talk by a colleague from NYU yesterday about this. Many of them actually could have gone through the standard pathway. It wasn't that they were blocked from going through the standard pathway for some reason. It's just that a choice was made, sometimes because of the commitments of the doctors who were doing it. There was one company for ALS, actually the same disease that Bill was talking about, his thinking about a clinical trial, that the ALS community was one of the communities, although it was by no means uniform, that was more supportive of the Right to Try law. And the law was named after 4 people, one of whose name was Matt Bellina. And the company Brainstorm, which is actually an Israeli company developing stem cell therapies for ALS, had said, we are going to make our treatment available through the Right to Try Act. And once the act was actually passed and they started to look at what it would actually take and what it would cost them to do it, because companies can't charge for the product under Right to Try, they said, oh, sorry, we didn't actually mean it. We'll give it to Matt Bellina because the law was named for him, so we want to thank him for all of the work that he and his family did, but we're only going to give it to him. So there has been very little use of it's hard to know because we don't know the details of all of the cases, but there's been very little to almost no use of the Right to Try law when the expanded access law, which has been on the books for 30 years, was not available.
But I think you raise an interesting point that we've encountered in some of the conversations that we've had, is that certainly the nature of the disease, shapes people's thinking about the risks that they're willing to take. So we were talking to somebody at the Alzheimer's Association that, for a long-term disease like Alzheimer's, there isn't the same, immediacy that drives people's decisions as it is with ALS. And I think that's something really important to consider.
Absolutely, that's one factor. And obviously, people have very different values, and some people, their value is, I want to try anything that I can to deal with this awful disease that I'm dealing with. And other people are, I prioritize my quality of life. I prioritize my time with my family. I don't want to do anything that could make it worse. And I'm going to take a completely different approach. And we have to respect all of those different things, those different ways that people can approach these very difficult situations that they're dealing with.
So I want to end with one last, I think, really forward-looking question from the audience here. That as we're moving into different types of drugs, such as cell and gene therapy platforms, how do you expect clinical trials to adapt and the market to adapt to those new kinds of drugs?
One of the things, the promise of precision medicine, which is only partly realized, but it's early days, is that not only will drugs be highly targeted towards the individual features of your disease, but because they are such a close sort of key and lock fit to your disease, they'll actually be really, really effective. So if you're doing research that's looking for a very small effect, which might actually be worth trying to actually accomplish for a common disease, then you're going to need to do that in hundreds or thousands of people. But if you're looking for really large effects, really dramatic effects, and that's the goal of these highly targeted precision therapies, you may actually not need nearly as many people. You may be able to do trials in much smaller numbers of people. The size of the population that you need to study, or the size of the sample in your trial, is related very closely to the size of the effect that you're looking for. So if you're looking for a very large effect, you can have a smaller trial. The other thing is, when you need randomization, you need a comparison group when you're looking for moderate size effects, because if things look a little better than you expected them to look, well, is that because the people that I got in my trial, they just sort of were a little bit better on average, or they were a little healthier, or their disease was not quite as bad? Or was it because my drug actually had an effect? You can't tell without a comparison group. On the other hand, if you've got a huge effect, If you've got people who had, if you had pancreatic cancer, one of the most devastating cancers that people can get, and you had a drug where 10 people survived 5 years, you don't need a comparison group to know that that is a home run drug, and you can go ahead and approve it. So if the science really gets that much better, if we're really getting large effects for diseases where we have a pretty good idea what would happen in the absence of that drug, then the clinical trials paradigm is going to change. We may not need randomization every time, and we're going to need far fewer people.
Well, we'll invite you back in 5 years.
All right, I'll tell you how it worked out.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for a really enlightening discussion of these really complex issues. We have a ton of questions that we couldn't get to, so if you don't mind hanging out for a few minutes afterwards, please feel free to come down and chat with Steve individually. I'll give you a heads up that in June we'll be doing our next installment of the speaker series focusing on artificial intelligence and the advancement of deep fake technology, which should be fascinating. That's in conjunction with a new exhibit in our Now Next gallery that'll be opening at the end of March, so we hope you'll come back, both for the exhibit and the talk. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you back here again soon.